Hello, today we're going to be reading chapters 9 through 12 of Serafina and the Splintered Heart. We're reading with the permission of Robert Beatty, the author. So, here we go. Chapter 9. Braden and Mr. Vanderbilt didn't turn toward Serafina or react to her in any way. They seemed not to hear her or see her, even though she was right in front of them. "Braden, it's me," Serafina said again, more loudly as she stepped even closer to them. "Mr. Vanderbilt, it's Serafina. Can you hear me?" But neither of them responded. She couldn't believe it. This was impossible. "Braden!" she shouted frantically, but she was standing right in front of them, and they couldn't see her. What in the world was going on? Her body began to tremble with fear. Preparing to return to his guests, Mr. Vanderbilt patted Braden's shoulder. "Stay here as long as you like," he said gently, "but when you're feeling up to it, think about coming back down to the party." "I will," Braden said. "It is beautiful. I can see the lights from here. I think maybe Serafina's pa was trying to light Biltmore up so brightly that she could find her way home," Mr. Vanderbilt said, his voice filled with a warm and gentle melancholy. Gideon, still laying 20 feet away, watched Mr. Vanderbilt walk back down toward the party, then looked glumly back at Braden. "Gideon, can you hear me, boy?" Serafina said to her old friend, but he didn't look up in her direction, and his long, pointed ears didn't perk up. He just gazed at Braden with sadness in his eyes. How was all of this possible? She was right in front of them, as plain as night. Serafina studied Braden and then looked at herself. The rays of moonlight coming down through the vine-covered lattice above her shone onto her body, casting her in an eerie, dappled white light. "Am I truly here?" she wondered. "Or am I still buried underground in the coffin, just imagining that I crawled out? Have I been cursed by a spell? Or am I some sort of whispery ghost or haint or spirit?" She thought about how quickly she'd been able to dart away from the talon-clawed creature in the forest, how skillfully she'd escaped the sorcerer, how quietly she had slipped past all the guests at the party. She brushed back tears as emotion welled up inside her. What had happened to her? Determined to make it stop, she stepped closer to Braden. "It's me, Braden, I'm back. It's me," she said again, her voice cracking, but Braden did not respond. He looked out across the moonlit forest and fields. His heart seemed forlorn, his mood dark. There was a tension in his face that she'd never seen before. She lifted her hand and looked at it. She slowly turned it one way and then the other in the moonlight. It seemed normal in every way to her, and yet he could not see her. She had felt hungry earlier, but maybe it was just because she had seen the food at the party. She had felt pain when she fell from the tree, but maybe that was what she thought she should be feeling. Was she just remembering how things felt? Braden breathed a long, heavy sigh, then began to move. He gripped the side of the bench, and with much effort, his arms shaking, he managed to get himself onto his crooked legs. He stood lopsided, tilted over like his body had been broken. Clearly exhausted by the exertion of getting onto his feet, he rested there, leaning his shoulders against the column for a moment. When he tried to take a few steps forward, it seemed at first as if he was going to be all right. But then he winced and his legs buckled beneath him. The metal brace tripped him up and he lurched off balance. Serafina reflexively darted forward to catch him so that he didn't fall, but he hit the ground anyway, grunting in pain as he crashed onto the gravel. Serafina stepped back in confusion. She was certain she had reached him in time, but she hadn't been able to hold him up. As Braden struggled to get to his feet, she stepped forward again and grabbed his arm to lift him. At first, she thought she was touching him. She had to be touching him because she could see her hands were on him. But then she slowly realized that she could not actually feel him the way she should, the true warmth of his living body. She knew she should feel it. She could imagine feeling it, but this was more like a memory of feeling. Her spirit was remembering the physical world the way an amputee lying in a hospital bed remembers his missing legs. Feels the movement of it, suffers the pain of it, even though it's gone. She slowly reached out and tried to touch his shoulder, and then his bare hand. There was something there, something like a physical object, but she couldn't feel the living warmth of it, and it was clear that he couldn't feel her at all. Up to this moment, she'd been interacting with the world based on her memory of her past life, but now she was like the amputee who sees with his own eyes that his leg is actually gone. It was becoming clear to her that she could no longer affect the physical world around her. It was as if the more she realized what was happening to her, the more she faded away. Gritting her teeth, she tried to hold herself together, but it was no use. She pressed her hands to her face and squeezed her eyes shut, trying just to breathe. She began to cry in confusion and fear. A dizzying nausea swept through her stomach. It felt like she was going to pass out, but she had to hold on. Braden slowly dragged himself and his bad leg over to the terrace's stone railing. He clung to the top of the railing for support as he looked out into the night. He seemed lost in thought, like he was remembering something. At first, she thought he was gazing out at the trees and the bank of clouds rolling in across the night sky. But then she realized that he was looking in the direction from which she had come. He was looking specifically toward the graveyard in the Angel's Glade. "No, she's not missing," Braden said, as if his uncle was still there. "She's dead and buried." Chapter 10. Serafina stepped back in horror. "She's dead and buried," Braden said. "Was Braden the one who buried me? Is it possible that I'm actually dead?" She knew she'd been buried. There was no denying that. But dead? She didn't feel dead. And even in Braden's discouraged hopelessness, she sensed something else, some other uncertainty in his eyes and tone of voice. He seemed to be waiting, frustrated, biding his time. Despite everything, despite the anguish and pain, there seemed to be a faint trace of hope in him. After Mr. Vanderbilt went back down to the gardens to rejoin his wife and the guests at the evening party, Serafina wanted to stay with Braden just to keep him company, if nothing else. But the longer she stayed there, the more upset he seemed to become. She could see it in the shaking restlessness of his hands and legs, in the pained expression of his face, and even the unsettled way he was breathing. The mere closeness of her presence seemed to sadden and disquiet him. After Braden went to bed and the partygoers went up to their rooms in the mansion, Serafina went down into the basement to see her pa. She passed maids and manservants she knew by name. She saw footmen and assistants, but none of them saw her. When she finally came to the workshop, she found it empty. There was no sign of her pa. She waited a few moments, thinking he would soon return, but he did not. Her heart began to fill with a terrible dread. Had this too changed? She searched the basement room by room, the kitchens and pantries, the workrooms and storerooms. Biltmore was just too large. She finally found her pa repairing the small-wheeled electric motor that powered the house's dumbwaiter. She sighed with relief. Her pa was on his knees, pulling a wrench. The muscles of his bare, sweating forearms bulged. He was a large, gruff man with a barrel chest and thick limbs. He wore simple work clothes, a leather apron, and a heavy leather belt laden with tools. She had seen him working 1,000 times, had handed him screwdrivers and hammers when he needed them, had run to retrieve parts and materials for him. But she'd never seen him like this. There was no joy in his work tonight, no sense of purpose. He moved slowly, doggedly, his eyes mournful. He was going through the motions of his life, but his spirit was gone. "Pa," she said, standing before him, "can you see me?" To her surprise, her pa stopped his work. He slowly turned, as if gazing at the empty air around him. It was clear that he couldn't see her, but he stared at the emptiness for a long time, as if he was sure something was there. After a few moments, he pulled out a rag and wiped his brow, then lowered his head and wiped his eyes, a wave of emotion racking through his shoulders. She could see the flicker of memories in his face, the sadness in his eyes. She didn't know what Braden knew of her demise, but one thing was certain. Her pa thought she was dead. She could see it in his face and in the way he moved. His dreams of having a daughter had been the joy of his life for these 12 years, but now she was gone. He was alone, true and certain. Seeing him there by himself, her heart broke. Finally, he gave up on fixing the machine and sighed as if it was all pointless anyways. She'd never seen him break from a job before the job was done. The idea of leaving a machine unmended was inconceivable. As he hoisted the leather tool satchel over his shoulder and trudged back toward the workshop, Serafina followed him. He walked slowly, without spirit or purpose, like a wanderer who had nothing to go home to. She stayed close to him as he moved back and forth in the shop, putting his tools away and preparing his late-night meal. As he cooked his supper of chicken and grits over his little cook stove and then ate alone, she sat across from him in her old chair. It was here that she used to listen to his stories and share her own, telling him about the rats she had caught or the falling stars she'd seen streaking through the sky. But now her plate and her spoon sat on the bench unused for months. "I'll eat my grits, Pa, I swear I will," she said out loud as tears welled in her eyes. A little while later, when he lay down in his bed and fell asleep, she crawled onto her own empty cot behind the boiler and lay down. She didn't know what else to do. When you're dreaming, what happens if you fall asleep in your dream? Do you dream? And is your dream real life? If she was dead and buried, how could she be tired? She didn't know, but maybe sleep wasn't about the body, but about rest for the mind and the spirit. All she knew was that she was exhausted. Trembling and forlorn, she curled up into a ball. As she fell asleep, she slipped into a dream where she was biting and clawing, fighting in a black, swirling world. And then it all fell away, and all she could feel was the earth and the river and the wind. A vast world without form. And she felt herself being swept through it like she was nothing but a particle of dust. And then a tiny droplet of water. And then a wisp of air. Until she finally dissolved into nothingness. She started awake with a violent jerk. When she looked around the workshop, she didn't know whether she was awake or asleep. Did she just dream of her death? Or was her death the reality, and what she was experiencing now the dream? She remembered the frightening sensation of her feet being torn into little pieces by the current of the river, and the feeling of the wind high in the trees almost sweeping her away. I only have so much more time left here, she thought, and then I'm going to fade away completely. She looked at her surroundings, trying to understand. It was dark, the witching hour, between 3 and 4 a.m. Still shaking from the dream, she rose from her bed and stood in the workshop, not sure what to do. She just stood there and breathed and tried to figure out whether she was truly breathing or dreaming of breathing or remembering breathing. Finally, she went over to her pa, sleeping on his cot. She tried to touch his side to make sure he was truly there. She felt a vague shape, but no warmth, no response to her touch. It was just as it had been with Braden. Even though she couldn't feel her father's warmth, and he couldn't feel hers, she curled up beside her pa like a little kitten, so small and light that it wasn't even felt against its master's chest. And she tried not to sleep. In the morning, when her pa woke and began his day, she tried to touch him, tried to speak with him, tried to tell him what was happening to her, tried to warn him about what she'd seen in the forest, tried to tell him to check the stream flowing into the pond. But the more she tried, the more sadness it seemed to cause him. Her presence wasn't a comfort to him, but a sorrow. She was haunting him. Finally, when he gathered his tool bag and went off to work, she let him go. Not because she wanted to let him go, but for mercy's sake. Serafina sat alone at the bottom of the basement steps, her head on her hands. She had to figure out a way to get back into the world and warn everyone that they were in danger. She'd been attacked, and clearly Braden had been attacked, and she was sure that there were more attacks to come. But what can I do? She asked herself. How could she talk to the people she loved? How could she warn them? She had found Mr. and Mrs. Vanderbilt, Braden, Gideon, and her pa, but there was one more person at Biltmore who might be able to help her. She went up the back stairway to the 4th floor and down the corridor into the maid's quarters. When she came to the particular maid's room she was looking for, the door was ajar. This is chapter 11, by the way. As Serafina paused, a bad feeling crept into her. "Essie?" she asked quietly. "Essie, are you there?" Finally, Serafina slipped slowly into the room. Her friend Essie's room was empty and lifeless. Essie's books and newspapers weren't on the nightstand by the bed. Essie's drawings of flowers and plants weren't on the wall. Essie's clothes weren't strewn across the floor and chair. The bed had no sheets or pillow. Serafina's heart sank. No one was living in this room anymore. Essie was gone. Remembering her friend's old mountain stories of haints and night spirits and other strange occurrences, Serafina had hoped that maybe Essie could help her, that maybe she could even talk with her in some way, but it was all for naught. It just seemed so unfair, so wrong. She was home, but she felt homesick. Why couldn't everything just stay the way it had been? She'd made friends and found a new family. She'd worn beautiful dresses and had English tea with lots and lots of cream. She'd met her mother and run at her side. She'd nuzzled her head and felt her purr. But what had happened to her mother and the cubs? Were they gone like Essie? Serafina couldn't bear the thought that something bad had happened to any of them. As she stood in the room, she noticed the mirror on the wall. As soon as she saw it, she froze where she was, and her heart began to pound. "Oh no, I'm not doing that," she said firmly. She didn't want to move towards it. She was too frightened to put herself in front of it and look at it. What would she see? Her old self? A whispery haint? A grave walking ghoul bloodied with wounds she could see on her torn, blood-stained dress? She was a ghoul. Suddenly, she was sure of it. The last thing she wanted to see was the bloody, corpsey sight of her walking death. "Get a hold of yourself, you frightened little fool," she scolded herself. "You've got to figure this out. You've got to look." She pulled in a long, deep breath. She took a step toward the mirror, then another. Finally, she slowly moved a little bit in front of it and looked at herself. All she could see in the mirror was a glint of light, a faint blur of motion when she moved, as if she was nothing but air itself. She had no reflection. She was nobody and nothing. She remembered back to the time she'd looked into this mirror and noticed her amber eyes starting to change and her black hair starting to come in, and how proud she'd felt of the beautiful dress she'd been wearing. Now she had no eyes, no hair, nothing. So much of what she had come to know and love had just slipped away. Was this the work of the sorcerer, or was it simply how time passed? It felt like it was more than that. It felt like her world had been shattered into 1,000 pieces, like a Ming vase on a tiled floor. She kept wondering if she could pick up the pieces and put them back together again. "Stay bold," she told herself sternly. "Stop this nonsense, feeling all sorry for yourself. Dream or real, dead or alive, you don't give up. You don't give in to hopelessness. You keep fighting." Then, even as she was thinking these thoughts, she saw something very faint in the movement of light and air in the reflection of the mirror. There was something behind her. When she turned to look at what it was, she noticed the tiny particles of dust floating in random motions in the rays of the morning light coming through the window. She stepped toward the floating dust. She marveled at how she could see the shape of each particle, the way it turned and caught the light as it tumbled through the air. The dust reminded her of the words spoken at funeral rites when a loved one was buried. "And we commit her body to the ground," the pastor would say. "We all go to the same place. All come from dust and all return to dust. Earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust." As she studied the slow swirling motion of the dust in the sunlight, she whispered, "That's what I am now, specks of dust floating in the air." She lifted her hand and passed it slowly through the rays of light. Her hand caused no shadow, but she could swear that the motes of dust whirled up in little clouds around the movement of her hand. "I'm here," she said. "Just a little bit. I'm still here. Even if I'm just a minuscule speck of dust or a gust of air, then I still exist. There's still hope." She looked around at Essie's empty room. The past was behind her, the future unknown. But what now? She looked out the window toward the mountains. Great banks of dark clouds were rolling across the peaks, vast sheets of rain drinking up the rays of sun. The water of the French Broad River had risen so high in the last few nights that the ancient river had burst its banks and flooded the lagoon. The lagoon had been drowned in the water of the rains, completely swept away. The storms are coming, she thought, and I've got to stop them. Chapter 12. On her way down to the first floor, Serafina descended the long, gentle curve of the grand staircase, walking in broad daylight past guests on the stairs. She jumped up and down in front of them and tried to touch them. She swiped her hands across the long skirts of the ladies' dresses, trying to make the material fly, but it made no difference. She spent her whole life hiding, but now she just wanted one person, any person, to know she was there. "Hello there," she said loudly to one of the many new lady guests who had arrived for the upcoming summer ball. "Beautiful dress you're wearing today," she shouted to another. "Your hat is on crooked, sir," she said to one of the gentlemen. Reaching the main floor, she went into the winter garden, where a number of young ladies in beautiful powder blue and yellow dresses were chatting over English tea. She tried to steal their sugar cubes and knock over their teacups, but she couldn't effect a thing. Then she noticed the faint trace of steam coming off of the tea in one of the cups, and she had an idea. She bent down and blew gently into the hot vapor, and to her surprise, it actually swirled in a new direction and disappeared into the air. Serafina smiled. She was making progress. Encouraged, she crossed over to the back corridor and slipped into the smoking room, with its rich blue damask wallpaper, elegant velvet chairs, and gold-leaved books on the shelves. When she had come here with Braden on Christmas Eve, they had been dressed in their finest clothes for the first Christmas party she had ever attended. "I just hope it wasn't my last," she thought glumly. But she wasn't going to stand around feeling sorry for herself just because she was dead. She walked over to the room's fireplace with its finely carved white marble mantel, and was relieved to see that the barn owl was still mounted there. Her old enemy, the powerful conjurer Uriah, and his treacherous daughter, apprentice Rowena, had been shapeshifters able to change into the white-faced owl at will. Long ago, Uriah had stolen this land from its rightful owners and formed his dark domain in the hidden forest of these mountains. He had killed many of the forest animals, as well as Serafina's panther father. But the arrival of Mr. Vanderbilt and the construction of Biltmore Estate freed the mountain folk and the forest animals from the conjurer's spells and brought new light into the area. Uriah had been obsessed with destroying Biltmore ever since. Filled with a hateful vengeance, he had created the Black Cloak, which allowed its wearer to steal the souls of its victims, and he had used the twisted staff to enslave the animals of the forest and attack Biltmore. As Uriah was flying in owl form, she had raked him from the sky with her panther claws, sending the bloodied bird tumbling toward the ground. She and her allies had struck down Rowena that same night. Serafina had hoped that she had destroyed both of them, but the truth was she didn't truly know. Waisa had told her, "It's the way of his kind that even when he seems to be dead, he is not. His spirit lives on. He hides in the darkness the rest of us cannot see." The morning after the battle, Biltmore's groundskeeper had found a dead owl in the forest, and they had mounted it over this fireplace. She remembered that it had looked so lifelike, but now it seemed dead and worn, its feathers graying and tattered, the living spirit gone. It reminded her of the dried, white, desiccated shell of a rattlesnake after it had shed its skin and become anew. She couldn't help but wonder if the robed sorcerer she'd seen by the river might have been Uriah in some new form. Had Uriah been the one who attacked her on the Logia the night of the full moon? Was he the sorcerer causing the storms in the forest? Had he returned to destroy Biltmore once and for all? Or was it some new enemy that she'd never seen before? Whatever the answer was, she had to stay watchful. For the rest of the afternoon, she practiced moving particles of dust, shaping tendrils of steam, and causing candles to flicker as she studied the comings and goings of Biltmore. She followed people through their daily lives, watching them from the shadows, as a shadow herself, looking for signs of suspicious behavior and clues to where something was amiss. It wasn't until later that evening that something caught her eye. The formal dinner in the banquet hall started promptly at 8, with many of the guests and staff talking about the heavy rains, the muddy condition of the roads, and the water collecting in the fields where the acres of crops were being lost to the flooding. Braden was sitting near his aunt and uncle. Her friend seemed to be in somewhat better spirits than the night before, well enough to at least come to dinner. But there was still a dark and unsmiling gloominess to him. A mustachioed gentleman at the table tried to speak with him. "It's good to see you, Master Braden. I was terribly sorry to hear that you've given up your riding. I know you have always enjoyed your time with your horses." It seemed as if the gentleman was trying to be kind, but Braden's face hardened to his words. Serafina wondered if she could get Braden's attention by swirling the water in his water glass or something. There had to be some way to signal him, to let him know that she was there with him. But as soon as she approached him, Braden became even more upset, muttered that he was tired, and quickly excused himself from the table. "Good night, Braden," Mrs. Vanderbilt said, concerned that he was leaving so soon. "Sleep well," Mr. Vanderbilt said to his nephew, but then touched Braden's arm, drew him closer in, and spoke to him in a soft and quiet tone. "Remember, the servants will be double locking all the doors tonight, and guards will be posted." Braden clenched his jaw and walked away from his uncle without saying a word. Serafina was taken aback by the rudeness of Braden's behavior, and she thought that if Mr. Vanderbilt had some inkling of the dangers surrounding Biltmore, then locking the doors and posting guards made perfect sense. But it almost seemed as if Mr. Vanderbilt was telling Braden that the doors would be double locked, not to keep something out, but to make sure Braden didn't try to leave the house. And Braden was none too happy about it. She followed her friend as he trudged up the stairs to his room, dragging his metal-braced leg behind him. In months past, she had seen him heal a fox, a falcon, and other animals. It was part of his connection to them, part of his love for them. But he couldn't heal humans, not even himself. And it was clear that something had gone terribly wrong with him. His dog, his horses, it was so sad that his grief had kept him away from his only friends. When Braden arrived at his bedroom door, Gideon was waiting quietly for him outside of his room. "I don't want you following me," Braden said harshly to Gideon. "Just stay away from me." The look on the dog's face was so miserable that Serafina wished she could kneel down beside him and pet him like she used to. "I'm sure he doesn't mean it," she said to Gideon, even though the dog couldn't hear her. And the truth was, she wasn't sure of anything anymore. Maybe Braden didn't mean it. As Serafina followed Braden into his bedroom, she was surprised by the state of it. The last time she'd seen his room, it had been warm and tidy, but now it was a mess and disheveled, with days-old food trays piled up on the dresser and dirty clothes all over the floor. The four-poster bed was unmade. The drapes were covered with dust. It looked like he hadn't cleaned his room in months, and hadn't let the servants in either. He exhaled a long, tired breath as he collapsed into the leather chair by the small, unlit fireplace. He rubbed his bad leg with his shaking hand. His other leg moved in constant restlessness, and he kept pulling his hand through his hair, then wiping the side of his face. He wasn't just exhausted, but anxious and frustrated. Serafina remembered visiting him here one night and curling up on the rug in front of the warm fire with Gideon as Braden slept quietly in his bed. But now he just stared blankly into the dead ashes of the empty black hearth. Suddenly Braden got up. His metal brace thumped the wooden floor as he paced, pressing his trembling fingers to his skull as if there were voices in his head. More agitated than ever before, he changed out of his black dinner jacket and trousers and put on the rugged clothes he used for hiking. Then he got down onto his hands and knees and pulled a coil of rope out from under his bed. "What in tarnation are you going to do with that?" Serafina asked out loud. As the rest of the house retired for the evening, Braden opened one of his windows and hurled the rope out into the darkness. It had been raining hard all night, and now the wet spray of it just blew into the room. "Just what's going on in that head of yours, Braden?" she asked him, feeling a terrible tightness in her chest. She could see that his hands were trembling something awful as he struggled to tie the end of the rope to the bed. The shaking was so bad he could barely manage it. Then he went over to the window. "Braden, whatever you're thinking about doing, don't do it," she told him. But he climbed out onto the windowsill, his hands and knees slipping on the rain-slick surface, and started to crawl out. He couldn't maneuver his braced leg well enough by his own power, so he lifted it with his hands, then dragged himself over and began climbing down the rope on the outside of the building. This was an insanely dangerous thing to do, even for an able-bodied person in dry weather. But the sickly, crooked-legged boy was climbing out the window in the middle of a rainstorm. There was a 40-foot drop to the stone terrace below. The fall was going to kill him. "Be careful, Braden," Serafina shouted at him angrily, the storm whipping her hair as she leaned out. All of a sudden, a gust of wind lifted her off her feet, trying to sweep her away with the blowing rain. She felt herself rising upward, pieces of her spirit, her soul, whatever it was, tearing away and disappearing into the gale. All she could do was cling for dear life to the window jamb and try to stay whole. As Braden climbed down the outside of the building, she watched helplessly. If he lost his grip, she couldn't save him. He'd fall and die. Lightning flashed through the sky. Then a roar of thunder cracked overhead. It's the end of chapter 12.